been our pleasure having Tuiono with us for this whole week, and actually really for the over 2 months, because we have been having these conversations over a stretched out period. With the privilege of having him around in Pami, this has been great in terms of having an ongoing conversation. But today with the white paper, it's sort of the culmination of our this phase of the Activist-in-Residence program with Tuiono. But this is hopefully the basis for an ongoing conversation on this concept of solidarity and deconstructing and decolonizing racism as we think about it from the standpoint of solidarity. I just want to open up with the broad theme that we are going to discuss today, and then let Tuiono really talk about some of his ideas. We will then dialogue, I will wrap up, and then hopefully open it up to our audience and our Facebook audience for questions and conversation. So one of the things that really struck us when having this conversation about why we need to think about the idea of solidarity is the recognition that whiteness and its colonial techniques work on the principle of divide and rule. Divide and rule is a classic technique of colonialism, where communities of color, colonized peoples, are often placed against each other as in conflict with each other in order to consolidate white power and in order to consolidate the colonial extractive logics. With that then, I will open up to you, Tuiono, to talk about all of this.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank Kia for providing this space for activists in general. We don't usually get invited into the Academy, so thank you very much on behalf of all the activists that have been privileged enough to come here to speak and to share the space, and also for all the other activists that will follow after me as well. So I really appreciate that. For me, it's often when you're out there organising and doing things, you're really often just dealing with the things that are really just in front of you. So having a kind of some parameters set up so you can actually reflect on what you're doing is for me was quite a new thing, but also a good thing as well, to have that kind of space to actually reflect on some of these ideas and to sort of really balance them out and see how they might sit within different types of frameworks and so on and so forth. I did also want to take a step back and acknowledge that today, August 9th, is International Indigenous Peoples Day as well, and acknowledge all the Indigenous peoples that are holding it down on the front lines, whether it's over in Mauna Kea or previously over in Standing Rock, or pushing back against the repressive regime in Brazil with Bolsonaro, and of course acknowledging what's happening up at Ihu Mātau at this particular point in time. So tēnā koutou mō tērā o nā āhuatanga. Koe tēnei tuaken, e noho anei, ko Tuiono Tuiono. My name is Tuiono Tuiono, no Ngai Takato, me Ngāpahi, me te pāne o te Koki Airani. So my name is Tuiono Tuiono. On one hand, I am from Ngāpahi in Ngai Takato, which is north of the Harbour Bridge, and my father's also from the Cook Islands. So on one hand, I'm a migrant, first generation migrant. My father migrated here to get work, and on the other hand, I'm also tangata whenua as well. But I'm Māori on both sides. Cook Islanders consider themselves Māori, and Māoris here consider themselves Māori. So I'm Māori as well. In reflector, I was kind of thinking about how and why it's important for me to build solidarity with different groups like refugee communities and migrant communities, and why that was central to a lot of the things that I do, particularly as somebody who has been very involved in Māori activism, and very involved in the sense that I've spent a lot of my time working in Indigenous people circles, not just only here in Aotearoa, but also within the wider region and also overseas as well. And for me, when you take that wider view, you can actually see those types of connections. Part of that, of course, and I explored that yesterday with the public talk, was a lot of the upbringing that I had. So all of my role models are all my relatives. So my parents, my mother, my father, my grandfather, who came here from the islands as well, who was a trade unionist and an organiser in his own right in our Pacific Island community as well. And I always, when I think about a Māori worldview or a Pasifika worldview, the foundations of that is whakapapa. And for me, when I look at whakapapa and a Māori worldview, I think that it cannot be contained or should not be contained within the constraints of the nation state. So North Island, South Island, and whatever territories that New Zealand has. Because when you look at our connections as Māori and Pasifika from a whakapapa base, and if you check out on the PowerPoint slide there, it stretches right across to a whole lot of different territories. And it's the way that I kind of use my way to navigate my way through different communities as well, acknowledging that there is this long history of connection that stretches to Raiatea and Taputapu Wātea, down to us here in Aotearoa at this particular point in time, up to folks in Hawaii, over to Rapa Nui. You know, there's linguistical heritage there, there's cultural heritage there as well. So even on Rapa Nui, and I'll give this, it's a bit of a side thing, but I'll share it anyway. I was working at the UN, and I was in Geneva, and there was a whole lot of Māori activists from Rapa Nui, from Easter Island. So they've been colonised by Chile, so they speak Spanish along with their own language. And the only way that I could communicate with them was using New Zealand Māori, bits of Tahitian I picked up from my grandmother, some Cook Island Māori from my childhood. And so I'd spent all this time communicating with them like this. And I was there for 2 weeks, and we were organising at I think it was the Expect Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous People, I think it was, or was the Working Group of Indigenous Populations, was some time ago. So I spent all this time talking with them for a week, and then the second week we were at the UN, and we were, you know, writing interventions and putting them up to, you know, the different states that were there and so on and so forth. And then one of them next to me started speaking English, and I was like, "Can you speak English?" And she was like, "Can you speak English?" I was like, "Oh man, I've just been spending this whole entire week trying to communicate with you people." But because I thought they couldn't speak English, that they could only speak Spanish, and they thought I couldn't speak English. They didn't know very much about Aotearoa New Zealand as well. So it was interesting that we could find this way to communicate with each other using the languages of our ancestors, and assuming that neither of us knew the others, the language of the colonizer as well. And so for me, when I place myself in that particular space, it's understanding that the borders established by the nation state are not. We should not be contained on that, and we should build solidarity not just within the Pacific, but also outside of the Pacific as well. Because I think there is, if you look at the framework of whakapapa, not just from a genealogical point of view, but also a cultural point of view, linguistic, if you like, as well, but also from the perspective of struggle, how different struggles are connected and related, you start to begin to see the connections that we might have with other folks who might be, say, for example, resisting the same multinational corporations over in wherever they might be fleeing, say, for in the case of refugees as well. The challenge is, of course, communicating this with different people, not only with my own community, but also building solidarity and trying to build solidarity across cultural difference and linguistic difference and that sort of thing as well. So that's often the project. What's I think interesting for me is because I've been in the space for such a long time that you recognise that when the apparatus of the state and white supremacy, which kind of underpins colonisation. I mean, like for me, colonisation is founded on white supremacy, the idea that Europeans and European countries are more superior than other people, so therefore that gives them the so-called moral right to come to New Zealand and just take it over, or the Americas or wherever, and so on and so forth. That when the gaze of the state or the gaze of white supremacy is on one hand at some particular point in time on Māori, it can often shift to, say, Muslims down in Christchurch, and then shift again on say, some vulnerable Asian communities within Aotearoa as well. And for us to see as these communities that shift, and to understand it for what it is, and to understand that often, because we are also raised and brought up here as well, to notice and to take note that when those mindsets of white supremacy also become prevalent within our own communities, and finding ways to unpack that, but also to challenge it. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, that's what I've been thinking about like the last this week or so. Probably a couple of other other ideas as well, and also thinking about how you organise just not only here as well, but also in the places that where you live. I think is another kind of reflection that I have. One of the heartening things for me is actually, and I don't know if people consciously know it or not know it, that other communities are starting to see those connections and rise up and support each other. So you saw in Christchurch, a lot of Māori communities open up the marae so that those whānau can feel looked after, and there was sort of about a manaakitanga. One of the interviews I did with Anjam Rahman, I asked her about one of the most inspirational moments of solidarity, and she talked about how the mongrel mob said they were going to show up to the mosque and support them and that kind of thing. I was recently just up at Ihu Mātau, and we had Muslim whānau come on. There was a group called Asian Supporting Tino Rangatiratanga coming onto the occupation as well. So it's for me all these different groups understanding what is happening in terms of colonisation, what is happening in terms of whiteness within Aotearoa New Zealand, and knowing that in order for us to collectively push back against that, we need to reach out and connect with each other. The other thing that also was that also comes up fairly regularly in the discussions and talks and some of the reflections that we've had as well is the need for working class solidarity. And how that has dissipated over time with the for those of us that remember the 70s and the 80s when the trade unions had like massive numbers, and even within the universities there was compulsory student membership, and the student movement itself was actually a force, a political force in Aotearoa New Zealand. Not so much now, and how that really strong need for working class solidarity needs to happen as well, and how that is the project, I think, for Pākehā allies and Pākehā activists to actually build that within their own communities. Because often a lot of the kickback comes from working class Pākehā who for some way feel more aligned with people, with the billionaire class than, say, their fellow working class people living often right next door to them as well. So it's about how do you bring that back? Of course, there's there's a proud history of that type of solidarity. If you look up at Bastion Point and even up at Ihu Mātau, trade unionists are always there, environmentalists are always there as well. That was the same Bastion Point as it was in Ihu Mātau as well. And so how do we expand that connection? How do we learn from that? I mean that history goes even right back to, I think of another example with what happened with World War One. You had Christian socialists who were opposing conscription into World War One, and at the same time you had Te Puia Herangi opposing World War One as well. So there was this nice alignment between Pākehā Christian socialists on one hand and conscientious objectors and what was happening in Māori communities, in this case in particular in Waikato as well. Also with what was a little bit after that, with the independence movement in Samoa as well. There were trade unionists who were supporting the Samoan independence movement along with socialists as well. And there was also movement within the Māori community itself as well. And it's often a part of history that is hidden. A lot of this history is just not disseminated as well. And in the case of Samoa, what happened there was so appalling that Helen Clark went and apologised. And it was on TV1 and TV3 News that, Helen Clark, then Prime Minister Helen Clark, was going to apologise to Samoa, but I don't think most people understood the history of it because we never taught it. And what happened there was just absolutely appalling. And I'll give that as an example. In the aftermath of World War One, Samoa was split. It was German Samoa. The Americans took over what is now known as American Samoa. New Zealand administered what is now known as Western Samoa, but it was a military administration. The administration was so appalling that when the Spanish flu was flying around, they didn't quarantine their island properly, so it resulted in 20% of the population dying. 20%, like it's a massive, massive number. And there was, of course, agitation from Samoan activists pushing back against the state of New Zealand. And so you had concerns with Māori community here as well, and also with leftists like socialists and so on and so forth. But it resulted in one of the leaders, one of the Arikis over there of the independence movement, being imprisoned in Mount Eden, Tupua Tamasese IV. And the person that got him out of jail and got him back to Samoa, Maui Pomare, who was, in my understanding, was pushing back against conservative voices within his own political party. Tupua Tamasese went back to Samoa, and then when they were leading one of the marches, independent marches in Samoa, he was shot and killed. This is appalling, and Hancock went and apologised for it, but New Zealand has a lot of this history. And I think another part of the project is also getting people to get to grips with the history of our own country, of the places and the places that we stand in. And for me, when I was growing up in New Zealand and going to school and so on and so forth, you never learned about the Treaty of Waitangi. I never learned about the land wars. I would be fairly certain that most of the kids at primary school and high school here will know very little about the colonial history here in the Manawatu as well, and that creates lots of problems, because all of a sudden you're debating with people who have no knowledge of where they are and where they stand and the processes of colonisation, so it becomes a very difficult conversation to have. You're trying to debate algebra with somebody that can barely add, and that's how it feels sometimes when you're dealing with the Don Brashes and the Hobson's pledges and so on and so forth. The amount of willful ignorance out there is a challenge. One of the challenges, and you can see that with some of the things that happen. Like for example, we had in the Manawatu that there was a guy that thought it was okay to decapitate the penis of the Māori carving in Woodville as well. He thought it was not that offensive. He had no idea that it would be that offensive. And that speaks to me of the wide amount of ignorance, not only for that man, but also with New Zealand. And also, if you look back in what was happening in Christchurch with the terrorist, he didn't even have to hide. He was just walking around in plain sight. And a friend of mine put it plainly, he was like, if they would have tried to find it, would have been trying to find a snowflake in snow, And RNZ did this really interesting desktop research analysis through the papers of the GCSB and SIS to see how many times white supremacy came up in terms of the word itself and all their official documents. Not once. They never investigated any white supremacists at all. They're always like investigating Muslims or Māoris or environmental activists or peace activists or whatever, but generally speaking, whiteness got a big, huge hallway pass. So for me, the landscape is very clear about how we move and navigate in this kind of space. It's about trying to find the resources and the skills to actually fill it so that we can have a proper conversation about these things.
So one of the things that is striking in this conversation, Teanau, is the importance of pedagogy, and pedagogy that sees linkages or connections working across spaces. So to give an example, for instance, pedagogy for migrants and refugees that specifically attends to the history of colonization and how that connects with their own histories. So to give an example, for instance, neoliberalism as a neo-colonial formation thrives on this idea of individual merit and individual success. So that often works with professional migrants, middle class and upper class migrants, in terms of cultivating a narrative of, oh, I'm here because I am meritorious, I'm succeeding and contributing to the economy by paying taxes, and then, oh, look at the lazy Maori. So the way in which you address that kind of whiteness and white racism that is unfortunately taken up by particularly professional and upwardly mobile migrants is by showing the connections. And you also talked in a similar way in terms of similar kinds of worldviews sometimes held by Maori with respect to refugees.
Yeah, and I mean, I see that within my own community as well. It's, we've got to think about and focus on ourselves. It's, you know, don't worry about the migrants and the refugees and so on and so forth. And you're exactly right about it being one of the, I don't know, insidious things of neoliberalism is that it individualizes everything, and it doesn't take account that actually underpinning a lot of the stuff is economic. That there is, you know, an inequitable wealth distribution as well. So, like one of the examples that I showed yesterday was how the two richest people in New Zealand, their wealth increased by $1.3 billion, while the bottom 50% of New Zealand, their wealth decreased by $1.3 billion. So it's about recognising, hey, you know what? There is actually enough. There is enough actual wealth there. It's actually been distributed well, and you know, and so it's a matter of trying to find out what some of the solutions are. And you know, one of them could be like a progressive tax system, so that more money you get, the more harder you get hit with taxes. Labor tried to do something with their tax working group, it didn't work, and now we still have these kind of problems and issues as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also recognizing in that process that neoliberalism itself is a project of whiteness.
Yeah.
Because, you know, when you talk about the top 1 or 2%, and who makes up that top 1 or 2%, it is a white community that makes up that top 1 or 2%, working on a colonial and extractive logic. So I think making that connection also becomes important. For instance, upwardly moving migrants to recognize that I am not going to be there, and I'm also part of this structure that is continuing to oppress and marginalize.
Yeah, it's definitely, that is definitely part of the project. And my conversations with Asian activists working in that space and other migrant activists working in that space, that is definitely something that they would challenge those upwardly mobile classes to actually deconstruct and to consider, and the complicity of them adopting the thinking of white supremacy and colonisation within their own minds. And we see that also with Māori communities as well. Mm-hmm. It's like not being able to see the actual connections and solidarity that you have with poor brown people who by and large look like us, and yet you want to align with power as well. Yeah. So it's about challenging that power and the paradigms within our own communities.
Another idea, Tiano, that we spoke quite a bit about is sort of in terms of, and this connects to the culture-centered approach, is the question of voice. Who is doing the speaking when it comes to marking racism, talking about it, and organizing against it? Who has the expertise to talk about it? Yeah. And one of the things we also recognize there is that whiteness also works within that space. So you often have white experts that become the experts on migration and movement and racism, while the voices of communities of color are often missing. Yeah. And solutions often, ironically, to questions of racism will be offered by white structures and white experts. I think that too needs to be interrogated in terms of who is sitting at the table, who has the voice, who is articulating the solutions.
Yeah, no, definitely. In the circles that I work in, Māoris are really good at calling that out. It's like, look, man, this ain't your party, out, you know. So I have seen it happen, but I don't know if that is necessarily the case across all communities as well. And I would imagine that it's quite different here in the academy, but it's definitely something that needs to be thought about as well. You only have to look at so from the case of Māori land occupations. Whenever there is a Māori land occupation, there is always a couple of different perspectives, and the perspective of power will always align with those voices which have their perspectives at heart. And so within the case of Ihumātao, from my opinion, it aligns with those who would benefit most from the treaty settlement process, or understand that who have a view that to challenge power, that they would not actually get back what they originally intended. So in most of these cases, all of the different groups have the same objective, but different ways of going about it. But the more kind of, probably use the word radical voices tend to be sort of marginalised. But if you look at the history of land occupation, so for example with Bastion Point, I mean it was exactly the same thing that happened up at Takaparawa, which is happening here in Ihumātao. History has shown us that Joe Hawke was right, and the socially conservative iwi leaders that opposed him were wrong. And so I think this generation of activists and that have learnt that lesson and have understood that, and that is one of the reasons why there has been a groundswell of support for Pani and Newton and that faction of the mana whenua occupying the land.
So with this then, what you're touching upon are codes of civility, codes of conversation that are built into normative ideas of whiteness. So I, sort of connected back into the academe, and sort of the lessons that I think flow from this into the academe are questions such as, with respect to what we can talk about when it comes to racism, and marking racism and challenging it is often situated within the normative codes within academia and the organizing logics of academia. So, for instance, at CARE, for talking about racism and making it on the surface, I feel we get targeted because we are talking about racism rather than talking in a coded language that fits into the prescriptive norms of white civility. And then you also, of course, have the performance of white fragility, right? Which is that, oh, how could you actually talk about this? I feel so hurt. So sort of again that individualization. Yeah. So looking at our conversation on racism or whiteness and individualizing it and then saying, oh, this is uncivil, I feel hurt, I have my tears because of this, and how could you do this? So all of a sudden it is the colonized, the migrant, the refugee that has become the violator that is violating the norms, the established norms of someone, right? Yeah. But along with this, I also think that, within the academe to make these spaces open, then we have to ask questions such as, where can we have these uncomfortable conversations? Like, how many Maori academics, say for instance, we have in the School of Communication, Journalism and Marketing, or in the College of Business? How many Maori academics do we have in senior levels? What are their experiences with racism? The same with what are the experiences of racism with migrants and migrant faculty within the structure. But then again also, what are the kinds of norms that work under the table? Because whiteness often works through its white networks that do things over phone calls, things under the table where deals are made, things through networks that are never visible. Yeah. So when something is too controversial, you might have a board of trustee or a donor call in the vice chancellor and say things, oh, why is CARE doing such and such thing? And that is never visible. That is never explicit. And you will not have structures to follow up with that because that is left opaque. Yeah. It is not transparent. So I think we have to ask these questions. Where is money in whiteness? Yeah. How is that kind of money constructing universities and what we can or cannot say?
So do you see that in the platforming of particular voices? So for example, there's one of the arguments that you've got to provide a balance. And that is clearly absurd if you look at it from the perspective of climate change, where you have 99% of the world's scientists who say climate change is real and some crazy fringe deniers. And there is often in this case they would say, well, we need to hear both sides of the debate. But actually you don't. And one of the things that concerns me in particular about this place is around the need and emphasis to platform racists and the alt-right like Don Brash and so on and so forth. A person who has no lived experience of what it means to be a person of colour or a Māori or so on and forth, no expertise or research in the area of history or in studies of race, yet he is continually platformed. So one of the things that was appalling for me to see was the pushback within Massey University to ensure that his perspective was shared and seen.
Right, and within that context also, don't you think it is quite telling to see the amount of pushback you get from the white structure
Yeah.
that is otherwise invisible and coded as civil and kind and, oh, this is not New Zealand, we are not racist kind of thing, right? But also, part of this is when you think about it in the context of Massey, and I think about the work of CARE, when we invited Tameiti to give a talk, then the conversation is, why don't you balance Tameiti with inviting Don Brash and having a conversation? And balance actually in that case is a strategy of white supremacy.
Yeah.
Balance keeps white supremacy intact, because what you're really saying is that the articulation of a community of color or a person of color against racism needs to be balanced with the racist also needing to have a voice, who has already have had a voice for centuries in oppressing and extracting and colonizing. So in that sense, I also think, Tuiono, that we have to really deconstruct this idea of free speech and what it means and how it upholds and recirculates whiteness.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that came up with some of the interviews I did and the conversations that I've had, where freedom of speech, they will privilege and push freedom of speech against all the other kind of rights that you might have, like the right to live and the right to, the right to not be
Dignity.
persecuted and the right to dignity and all these kinds of things. They push this particular thing. So like the right to be obnoxiously racist in the case of many of these alt-right people outweighs the right for people to feel dignity or the right to actually feel safe and so on and so forth. I mean, that's what's incredibly appalling for me, and I think for a place like Massey University, it really needs to take a deeper look at itself, because that is just not acceptable.
Right. And and part of my response, and I've said this also on media interviews, is that no, CARE would not be inviting Don Brash, because we are a center that is interested in the question of voices from the margins. Now, please convince me how Don Brash, as a white guy, as a white supremacist, is marginalized and therefore needs to have a voice.
Yeah, you need to be on News Hub and Breakfast Show, because they keep making these, what I would say, fundamental flaws in the mainstream media.
Absolutely. But you see, Tuiono, this is also a point, right? Even in the academe, and we need to come back to that, that this is a place where knowledge is being produced, if you think about it that way, that this kind of oppressive thinking is produced as normative, that somehow the idea of balance is actually the idea we need to work through, which is an oppressive idea and which is entirely out of touch with where movements are at this point. So you also see how backward this is in that sense.
Do you think it's part of the constituency of this university? I mean, it's an agricultural centre, and there's a lot of folks that come from, I would say, very conservative, right-leaning places and communities, and that underpins some of the values that are espoused, like, for example, pushing for a balance in a very imbalanced conversation.
I mean, I would love to hear from our audience, because I've only been here for a year, but I do think, I will just say this, that I think, in our discipline, we are having a movement right now called Communication So White. I think that Academe So White is a movement that needs to happen across the board, that this is a global phenomenon. I'm also seeing this with colleagues in the US, where, the right of white supremacists to speak on campuses is a critical question,
It's kind of, and it's quite funny, because the same people will bang on about how great World War II is, and they forget that World War II was about stopping Nazis. And yet here they are going to the nth degree to make sure that Nazis have a platform to spread their bile and hatred. This is what I find disappointing with a lot of what's happening in different universities and so-called progressive political spaces.
So the only thing I would say in wrapping up and connecting what you have taught us through this is, it seems that even within the context of the university, the way to push back is by and through connections. That is the only way to push back, because even as minorities and people of color, we often have the tendency to put other colleagues under the bus, other minorities under the bus when it comes to the structure giving us some rewards and dangling it in front of us. I mean, again, that is classic colonial divide and rule, that as long as you can get some token minorities to sit in positions of power, and then they can be your voice, we can keep on doing the same
old
thing.
shit.
Right?
Yeah.
So again, connection there seems critical as a way to fighting back and pushing back.
One last thought though. How would you succinctly describe that in relation to capital? I mean, is it just an exacerbating factor? So, like with your ComSo white thing, does that come into the conversation?
Absolutely, because you see, like in the university, at the end of the day, say with Tammy coming, what are the kinds of questions we would get? Oh, some donor called in and said, I'm going to pull back my money. What is that but capital? What is that but the capitalist occupation of the university, where the capitalist feels that they have the power to dictate the curriculum or to go on to control what goes on in academia, right? So I think marking that is critical so we are able to fight it, but also recognize that to push back against that is to actually push the university toward asking questions such as how do we make our relationships with donors more transparent and democratic. So when a donor calls, do you actually have to write it down and keep a logbook and make it public so that when I do a freedom of information, I'm able to see which donor called when, what are the kinds of pressures they put in, and what kind of demands they made, you know?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I'm fine because I don't work here, so I'm trying. Yeah, so it's okay for me to talk about that and to take the institutional racism possibly here and throw that under the bus. But good luck to all the academics here, particularly those pushing back against capitalism and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Would love to hear your thoughts.
They can pixelate your voice out, maybe.
Go forth as a white man and talk.
We talked about the value of working class activists and that kind of stuff.
I think of my students when I'm hearing you talk and this going publicly,
Yep.
and that I know where you're coming from in terms of the difficulty of communicating all that base knowledge
Yeah.
out to people who don't understand. And so I'm listening to your talk and thinking, how are my students hearing this? And we get accused of being too lefty liberal all the time in the course I teach. And so, yeah, as white honky female, okay, I've got the female thing, I've got a family background of feminism, I've got a family background of disability and stuff, but I can't communicate all that about myself in a public space quickly. But I hope for a day when we get past, we've got to use they label white at the moment, but I hope we can get past that label. And I still think colonialism is useful, but for me it's neoliberalism, it's maleness sometimes, or a lot of the time, as much as whiteness. Or for me it's neoliberalism and male more than whiteness sometimes. So I guess, I just wanted to put it out there. I'm really looking forward to when we can have these base conversations without some of the labels.
Yeah.
Just like when we talk about gender and sexuality at the moment, everybody is busy labelling something. We need that to get political traction. But looking forward and think in terms of thinking about solidarity, looking forward to a time when we can talk more in a more complex way with that base understanding. Just like to say that. Thanks.
Cool. I mean, I think it's kind of, we label these things, but actually at the heart of it is power.
Yeah.
And I know there was a academic in residence or activist in residence who came here and talked about Chinese privilege in the context of Singapore. So they wouldn't like whiteness would not be a problem there because that's not where power resides. But it is an issue here because of sheer numbers. 80-70% of the country's Pākehā, so power naturally resides there, so it's important for us to talk about that. But also, if we take away the label, and we can do, then we are essentially, whether you're talking about maleness or heteronormative stuff, or heterosexuality, or race, it is, for me at least, a question of power, and it's just that particular, in this particular context, that makes sense, particularly with what's happening over in the States, especially so since the terrorism of what happened in the United States was actually directly imported down to what happened in Christchurch as well. So,
the one thing I want to add also is that whiteness as a concept is an ideology, right? It's an ideology that produces as norm the notions of white supremacy. So in that sense, I think whether you think it is Christchurch or whether it is what's happening in Dayton or El Paso, whiteness does need to be named, because it does make white supremacy the norm, the normative ideal. And that gives you a way to actually resist, and forms the basis of your anti-racist struggle. And I too hope for a day where we don't have to name whiteness, but I think to get there we have to name whiteness and agitate against it,
What do you think about academic language as a non-democratic way of speaking? I mean, here we are talking about, arguing against whiteness, and for me, the very language we're talking in today and it's going public is it's part of that whiteness. The language that we're using is part of our institution.
it's class, eh? It's class as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm alright. I got 2 university degrees, but I left the academy about 20 or so years ago. But I've got enough of a thesaurus rolling around in my head to understand what all the PhDs around here are talking about. But I think it would be very difficult for some folks who have not got that background as well.
And I think that's a lovely question, because it also ties back then to these ideas like say whakapapa.
Yeah.
You're saying that idea is a great way to reach out, because people are able to see and relate to it. So perhaps finding what are some of the pedagogical tools that will work in that kind of way,
Yeah, well, whakapapa will work because that's how we talk about it in the Māori communities. But I would, and I would have been, one of the other things when I was driving here is trying to think of other ways and other things that people use to actually make this academic stuff more relevant in their communities. I mean, what does it mean for a working class Muslim whānau trying to talk about these ideas? I mean, they would, whakapapa might not be their cultural norm for them to talk about. It might be something else. And then also, I think the important question, within the context of New Zealand is, what does it mean for Pākehā working class people? How do you communicate these ideas to Pākehā working class people? Using these big words probably is not helpful, but what are some of the ways that could help, and how could that work? Given that in all of these sites of struggle, there are always trade unionists that show up to show and express solidarity, but how do they communicate with working class whānau? And that's one of the things I find frustrating, but also amusing about some people I meet that identify as socialists or anarchists or whatever. These people are supposed to be aligned and working with the working class, but some of them were actually terrible at talking in simple language and talking and communicating with the working class as well. So it was kind of like this disconnected thing. We're here to support the working class, but actually I don't talk like them at all, and I have none of their cultural values. You know what I'm saying? So it's finding those different ways to do that, whether it's a migrant community or a Māori community or a Pasifika community or a working class Pākehā community, finding ways to actually communicate and share these ideas without having to have a dictionary to do it. Maybe that's the project from Massey University.
Toby?
So, Tiana, I've known you for a while.
Yes.
Can you tell me, I think, interesting thing to hear from you is about what's actually worked in terms of anti-racist solidarity and working class solidarity, the protests that you've been involved in, I think. So was it Wellington 2005? There was a shutdown of the fascists. They had
yes.
Talk about that, or People's Collaboration, when you went up to Bolivia and Zapatista solidarity and all that.
Yeah,
just tell me what was really worked.
Well, this kind of stuff works with some Māori communities because it grounds it. So you're talking about whakapapa and so on and so forth, and they get it straight away because we're all brought up with it.
Right.
So talking about the connections that we have with people and so on and so forth. So that cultural paradigm works within those particular communities. There are emerging groups, so like one of the groups that we're up at Ihu Mātou as well, like Asians Supporting Tino Rangatiratanga, they've been taking the different kōrero coming out of Ihu Mātou and translating it specifically into languages to combat, particular media perspectives within their own ethnic media outlets as well. So that's one way that's done. They've literally taken that kōrero, translated it into their own languages and shared it out with their community. Because generally it's just whatever the Herald says and we just do that in whatever language and so on and so forth. So that kind of thing works as well. I know there is, I think one of the problems is just the lack of resources within working people's organisations, whether they're trade unions or independent workers organisations as well. There are projects that build solidarity within those spaces as well, but they never have a lot of resources or money. You know, those things that can actually go right across an entire community and go, okay, this is what we think as workers and so on and so forth. But there is there. So one of the things that I noticed when I went up to Ihu Mātou and some of these other sites of protest and dissension is that the activists themselves have actually learnt the lessons of the past. They've learnt from what happened at Bastion Point or Pākaitori and so on and so forth, and recognised patterns of behaviour and gone, okay, so when this happens, there will be a socially conservative part of the mana whenua who will side with power, and there'll be one group that will stand on the land, look after the environment, and so on and so forth. So when that happens, we should swing behind this group of people because we know that happens as well. We know certain things happen within different migrant communities as well, migrant activists do. So you recognise the patterns and then get on with it as well. And I think the same could be said within environmental activist circles as well, and also within working class Pākehā communities as well. Like Palmerston North is classic as well, because it's such a small place that when we organise things, like me and Toby used to organise in Wellington for 10 years, I know, long time. And so you could actually exist in the bubble. You know, we'd organise all this, you know, sometimes the people, like you go around, sometimes everybody had the same kind of haircut, same kind of music, same kind of ripped jeans, that kind of shit. And we could organise in those different ways where you go down to the marae and it's all the Māoris and, you know, that's that particular thing. And it was all very, you could exist within the bubble. But you can't do that in small towns here. And what I find refreshing, but also it also takes a bit more work, is that you have to actually reach out to actually get critical mass. So you have to actually build bridges with different communities. So when we had the Weapons Expo roll in here last year, one of the things that we said with the different activists was like, it can't be like Wellington. We actually have to do some speaking and reaching out to different groups, because in order to get critical mass to actually do what we need to do, we actually need to connect with a whole lot of different people right across a whole lot of diversity, cultural diversity, religious diversity as well. And that's just the hard yards of sitting down and having cups of tea with people and, you know, trying to negotiate relationships. And once you've done it a couple of times, people know who you are. I get people waving at me down the street. So from different communities, and I don't have the same religious background or from the same cultural background or even some of the same experiences as them, but where there is enough of a commonality that we can actually build stuff. That is I see that as the groundwork of the activists, to actually recognise that and to be able to communicate clearly in a way that shows empathy with as many people as possible with these types of ideas.
Let me ask you a question, Tian. So, you also have taken this work and done it in global contexts. What do you think are some of the strategies that enable you to take the very local nature of, say, rights work and connect it to global platforms?
It's kind of you know, whether I'm here organising with people from different religious backgrounds or from different communities here in Palmerston North, it is actually kind of the same sort of thing if you're organising in an international space. So I've done some organising in Latin America and in Africa and in Europe and in different things. And one of the things I guess is sometimes it's difficult, but also it gives you some spaces. A few times I've organised in multilingual spaces, so everything's been simultaneously translated into 4 different languages. So usually within Indigenous people spaces, it's English, Spanish, French, and Russian. So while that's happening, things slow down. So you actually have a bit more of a time to think. Actually, where is the consensus in the room, and where you can actually build those connections. But it is, for me at least, the same sort of tools that I would use. That these are people with a different kind of cultural background and stuff like that. And I shouldn't assume anything, but this is what we've got to get to in order to get some things done. But I've also been in particular spaces where we all speak one language, and we are able to organise things, and we've been able to do it under pressure. So an example of that is I was involved at the Paris Climate Summit organising. We had an Indigenous bloc, an Indigenous kind of group that was organising with what was happening with the then climate march there, but it got thrown into disarray because 10 days before all this stuff happened, there was a terrorist attack on the Bataclan. So all of a sudden there was a state of emergency across France, and in particular in Paris. So all of a sudden all these different events that had been planned had been now made illegal. Of course, that doesn't tend to stop Indigenous peoples. We've got certain things that we want to achieve, so it was about trying to navigate around what those constraints were, being cool with it with all the different groups, and then seeing what we can do to make things happen. And I think there was enough trust amongst all the different groups, because some of these folks I've been organising with for a very, very long time, even though they're on the other side of the planet, and also trusting that some of them have come with a very strong skill set. So one of the groups that was organising with the folks from Turtle Island was the Indigenous Environmental Network, and they were also very active in organising over at Standing Rock. And when you look at these things, whether it's Ihumātao, Standing Rock, and I'm assuming with Mauna Kea, but I definitely know it's true for Standing Rock and Ihumātao, is that people see a week or 2 weeks or whatever of what's happening there, but actually there's usually years and years and years of work that is under the formation, community building, skill sharing, capacity building, and all these other sorts of things. So for me, when I step into a room and I know that those skill sets and those experiences are there, you can easily come to a particular place where we are organised to take a particular stance with a set of actions or workshops or whatever, even though we are operating under a state of emergency, like as in the case with what happened in Paris.
Thank you, Tim.